Marcel Biato, thank you so much for joining me here in well, actually, we're just outside of Sao Paulo.
That's right.
In Santos.
Santos.
Though still the region of Sao Paulo, perhaps.
The greater São Paulo region.
Yes, here at the INAC conference, it is a pleasure to be with you. You are the Brazil's ambassador to the IAEA, or representative, permanent representative.
Right.
And you've had a long, distinguished career in this space, which we would love to learn about. So please, start off by telling us where you even learned about nuclear energy to begin with.
Well, to be slightly more precise about it, my relation with nuclear energy is relatively short. I'm a career diplomat, which means I get to do a lot of different things over different times. But the fundamental challenge for a diplomat is being a observer of the dynamics of the politics of things and of people.
Yes.
How people move around issues, how problems get created, how we find intelligent solutions that go through personal channels, institutional channels, conceptual channels for overcoming problems that should not avoid or impede us from achieving wider results. I've worked on war and peace issues. I've worked on issues of promoting development. I've worked on issues having to do with military affairs, international law, human rights court. And in a certain way, I think I can say that in the nuclear field, in a way encapsulates many of these aspects of how you can really use your professional experience as a catalyst in bringing about some of the fundamental changes we need, I think, above all in perceptions about nuclear industry, in making people appreciate the importance of what has been achieved, the risks that there are, and how we can overcome them to the benefit of our populations. I think nuclear energy and my work at the agency is exactly that. So if I could almost say that in a certain way, I'm exaggerating, that my career has sort of prepared me for my present job.
And what do you think it was about your upbringing that made you curious about being a diplomat, that made you want to understand how different people think how to negotiate? What was it about you specifically that led you down this path?
Well, certainly the fact that I'm a diplomat's son. It's in the family.
So you're exposed to it, yes.
Yeah. But also because I've always been interested in culture and history and language, and I think you have to dive into a different society, culture, to understand yourself.
Where are some of the places you've lived?
I was born in Argentina. I went to South Africa, where I got a first-hand view of apartheid. That's a long time back. Went back to Brazil, then went to the US. I did much of my primary schooling in the US. I went to Holland. I went back to Brazil. I went to Australia. Started university there. Went back to Brazil. Eventually got into the diplomatic field, and I served in London, Berlin, New York, and La Paz, Bolivia. So that's a bit of quite a variety of, and in each one with very different challenges and experiences. So, as I said, and Vienna is sort of, in a way, brings us all together within the context of nuclear industry.
And living in so many different places that are of different economic means, did you see firsthand how energy was integral into standard of living?
Oh, definitely. Well, I think you can start with Brazil. No? For example, at this moment now, one of the fundamental challenges that Brazil is facing is making the economy more competitive. And if you listen to our Minister of the Economy, he says we have to break up the cartels. So, for example, gas in Brazil is about 6 times as expensive as in the US, 3 times more expensive than in Europe. Why? There's no reason for that. Why? Because you have cartels.
But you have gas here too, yes.
But that's the point.
That's crazy.
And you have state cartels. No? Petrobras control the price of oil and gas, and basically because you have to understand the concept of government intervention and state as a purveyor of development, as a planning tool. And this is very strong in Latin American and many European countries. So the idea that the state sort of accumulates resources and then sort of dishes it out in a strategic, say, planning mechanism. But there are limits to this. And we have come to a point in Brazil, and this is, I think, the central pillar of the government we have now in Brazil, that you have to open up to society, you have to have entrepreneurs get things done, and you have to listen more to society rather than to decide government back in Brasilia what the solutions are. And so, for example, you have a system whereby government focuses resources, it decides where, it's sort of almost central planning in some ways, no? And it becomes very inefficient. And so the nuclear sector in Brazil is probably one of the first in which we're seeing the first attempts at this opening up. So, for example, we have mining is going to be opened up to the private sector.
Yes.
We are now going to have a sort of, it's called a multi-purpose reactor, which is going to be financed publicly, but it's going to be, let's see, on offer to the private sector. A whole series of initiatives opening up to foreign enterprise. We're going to finish the Angra 3 plant with foreign cooperation and resources. So it's a general opening up. So in many ways, we are the nuclear is at the forefront of these fundamental changes going on in the economy.
That's amazing. So what are some of the things that structurally need to change? Because the nuclear has previously been the domain of the Navy, of the government, of the state.
Yeah.
Do laws need to change in order to make it more open?
Yes. Well, no. The first step, which has already been taken, is sort of a diagnosis, almost an obituary, because it was almost dead in the water, which is to identify where are the gaps, where are the structural constraints. I would say that fundamentally, the nuclear industry in Brazil, the fundamental challenge we have is to make good on the fundamental advantages we have. One, uranium, sixth or fifth or whatever largest, let's say, resource availability. And secondly, we have the fuel cycle.
Yes.
No?
One of the few countries that has mastered the fuel cycle.
Yeah.
It is amazing to see what you guys have done.
And we have difficulty getting uranium out of the ground, going through the fuel cycle, and being able to have our nuclear plants fueled with our own uranium.
Why is that? What do we identify as the gaps?
They are basically structural, they are legislative, they have to do with financial difficulties, they have to have with public opinion difficulties. But the fundamental challenge, as I see it, which is now being addressed, is to make the nuclear fuel cycle commercially viable.
Yes.
That's it. That's it. So we need to take out enough uranium out of the ground to be able to have enough uranium enriched to be able to generate sufficient fuel to sell it and make it a going enterprise.
Amazing.
And this has not worked so far. And so the first step is, sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
So the first step is open up the uranium mining, deal with the environmental and legislative, let's say, institutional issues have to do with making the mine work. We have an old mine, a legacy site, which has a big public opinion eyesore.
Yes.
This is being dealt with. We have to build the infrastructure for the gasification, no? But that requires money, and so you have to have uranium mining work, right? And then you have to have Angra 3 to have a sufficient demand for enriched uranium to make the whole cycle flow. So you have to do all these things at the same time. That's what's being done today.
That's tricky.
Yes,
but is it also possible to export, if you have the whole fuel cycle developed, could you then maybe export the final product to other countries as well?
Well, that's the idea.
Yes.
And in fact, we do export low enriched uranium to Argentina. No? Argentina, there's interesting sort of synergy here, potentially in the future, in fact. Argentina is well developed through INVAP in producing research reactors, which they've exported to a large number of countries. And they are also helping Brazil in the design phase for our modular reactor, for our multi-purpose reactor that we're building. But they've exported to Australia, they're exporting now to the Dutch, Turkey, quite a large number of countries. While we have the fuel cycle. So there's a lot of room for working together with Argentina here.
That's amazing.
But we already do some export, but to actually export, let's say, the more enriched material that would be required for because Argentina has a can-do, no?
Yes.
So, but that is the objective. Exactly.
So the relationship with Argentina up until this point, let's say more holistically, is there a lot of trade that goes on already?
Yes. Yeah, well, it's our third trade partner. China, US, and Argentina.
So there's already established precedent for working together, both holistically and then within the nuclear sector.
Yes.
And then perhaps by combining the strengths of your two countries and already having that relationship and already being so geographically close, you guys could become a powerhouse, maybe to even spread nuclear power throughout South America.
Well, dream on. No, in fact, even in the nuclear industry, we have a lot of cooperation because we both have significant nuclear industries, and you have Argentinian technicians working in Brazil and vice versa, providing support. And very, very important, we have something which is quite unique, which is ABAC. You've heard about ABAC?
What's ABAC?
Yeah, ABAC is a bilateral safeguards regime. Which is within the wider umbrella of the International Agency, Atomic Energy Agency. And it means that Brazilian technicians go and do inspections in Argentinian nuclear industry and to control and provide oversight of its nuclear material, and they do it with Brazil. And it's all done within a wider framework involving inspections of the agency itself.
I see, almost like a buddy system. Do you know in swimming that you have to have a buddy system? Well, it's like Argentina and Brazil are safeguards buddies.
It's a very downsized version of Euratom.
Yes, I see.
So the point is we have a long-standing cooperation. In fact, it's an interesting tidbit here. We were in the past rivals, economic, military rivals, in fact. And the process of regaining democracy in both countries was a direct result of an accommodation of this rivalry between the two countries, because obviously rivalry is a good excuse to have militarized discourse.
To have authoritarian leadership, yes.
As well. And it was premised, among other things, or the fundamental point was an agreement that we would only develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. So you can say, and we do say, that it was the understanding between the two regimes, we're still during the military period in both countries, that we would not develop nuclear arms, that we would work together to develop our nuclear industries, we would have joint oversight. That really was one of the fundamental, let's say, planks on which democracy could consolidate, because we overcome this sense of rivalry that was manipulated politically.
Why can't the whole world work together?
Well,
like that?
we like to say that. Why don't India and Pakistan follow example?
Yes.
Yeah, well, we do.
And have you guys maybe even gone over there to explain how this works?
Yeah. But they say we're different.
No, humans are humans. At the end of the day.
No, I agree with you. But I think this is a very important point that people only. Like anything in life, technology can be used for good or bad. No?
Yes.
And so nuclear energy can be used for destructive and constructive purposes. In a very curious way, the threat of nuclear energy misused was the basis on which we, in a certain extent, recovered our democracy in our countries. So it's an interesting.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, the more that I learn, yes, even before I came into this industry, it's easy to build a loose association behind nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. But when you actually learn about the technology and you see how it's different, and then you see these real life examples of how the opposite is true, the more nuclear power that we spread, the more that we have the infrastructure and the relationships in place that discourage nuclear weapons.
Well, that's what we certainly would like to believe. And so when Brazil today, I'll give you another example, which I think is very relevant. Brazil, as you probably know, is developing a nuclear Navy propulsion system.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people come over and say to us, well, what do you want this for? This is more problems, more risk of proliferation, etc. I like to flip the point, is to say, Brazil wants nuclear energy, not because it wants to become a nuclear power and have, like a few other countries, the ability to threaten and terrorize other countries into abeyance because of the threat. No, we want to use nuclear energy for global governance. So, when you ask anyone, when you ask an official in the US government about what makes the US a superpower, what global good do you offer? And they will say, well, free maritime.
Right, we protect trade, global trade, which happens across the seas.
Which is 90% of all trade is maritime. So they say, we are a global power, and we have a right, and people acknowledge our this position. Why? Because we provide global goods. Now, if Brazil has a nuclear propulsion submarine, nuclear propulsion exclusively, nuclear arms, of course. And it is a form of projecting power into the Atlantic Ocean and providing what we want, which is to combat piracy, provide support,
safe travel across the ocean,
in research and development of the seabed, etc. Is that not a global good that we are offering?
Yes.
Is that not a legitimate ambition we have to use nuclear energy for?
I think it makes perfect sense. And what I'm hoping, maybe even secretly, or maybe not so secretly now, is that after you guys develop this technology for naval propulsion, perhaps you can translate it into commercial propulsion as well. We kind of had a hiccup with that in American history. We built one and then we let it go. We need to get our groove back. We need to be thinking, hey, how do we make nuclear-powered engines for ships? And if you guys are going to get at the forefront of that, perhaps you can translate it to commercial sector.
I think it's important to... When you speak with Celso Cunha in a few moments, he will possibly mention to you the idea of organizing next year a big sort of roadshow, roundtable for nuclear business. Why? Because we want to develop nuclear industry in Brazil precisely so that we can continue to develop this in a constructive way. Like in most countries of the world, nuclear industry begins from a military context, right? Especially the Navy. But then it branches out. You have all the spin-offs. And what we want in Brazil is precisely to develop this possibility. And this brings me to what I was talking to you just before we began, which is small modular reactors.
Yes, please tell me, what's your perspective on this technology?
The Brazilian Navy is developing a small modular reactor, as it were, as a nuclear propulsion drive system. Why don't we use this model to have civilian nuclear modular reactors?
And what makes Brazil particularly well suited to deploy SMRs?
As I mentioned, I think this is particularly interesting for Brazil. Why? Because we are one of those countries, continental dimensions, which significant parts of the country, relatively isolated, sparse population. So it becomes very expensive to provide energy. And I can give you an example of how one country is trying to face this challenge, which is Russia, with its exploration of oil in Siberia. It's too far to build gas pipelines, too expensive. There's nothing in between. So what do? What are they doing now? They're putting floating nuclear plants, which are being taken over to that area, and they're just plugged in. So you use nuclear energy to generate, to extract oil and gas.
They're using it to power remote cities, essentially, and then they can build a whole infrastructure around that.
Exactly. So why don't we do that in Brazil? Now, one advantage of this model, from our point of view, is that not only would it provide sustainable energy in remote areas without the need for very long transmission lines, etc.
Which would also destroy the environment. If you have to cut down
It can be, and it's a big political issue, political issue. But beyond that, we in Brazil, in a way, have followed the German model, which is to alternative fuels, which is basically solar and wind. And what would we have now? We have a similar situation that Germany has. but aggravated, which is that we have an integrated continental-sized grid, and certain parts of Brazil, the northeast above all, where there's a lot of wind, have now become sort of modules around wind generation. But wind generation is not base load. It's intermittent. And we have begun to see fluctuations in our grid.
Yes. The more that you deploy, the more instability you have.
So today, alternative, let's say, intermittent energy sources are roughly 10 to 15, almost 15% of the grid as a whole. And they are concentrated in certain parts of the country. So this begins to be a problem.
And why not, I heard the other day, you guys are at about 2-3% nuclear power right now. And plans to double,
roughly.
Okay, that's great, double. I like the number double. But why not make it 10 times as much? Why not try to get up to 20? But since it is that base load power, and a stable grid usually has 40, 50, 60% of its power as base load power, why not try to get, why aren't the plans to get nuclear up to 10, 20, 30, 40%?
Because politicians have to be prudent. But let me get there through a different channel. But going back to this issue, now people will say, okay, you have nuclear energy in the middle of the forest and so forth and so on. Is that going to be enough? Is that going to work? But everybody talks about alternative fuels. Is it going to replace the others? People, and you know what the environmentalists will say. But the answer is, why not put them all together? So you can have a triad with the nuclear, a small modular reactor providing the base load, on average something like 30, 40%. And then you can have the intermittent, basically solar and wind, providing, well, whenever it's available. And then because of the innate advantages and flexibility of modular reactors, it can ramp up and ramp down its generation to accommodate these fluctuations in the supply of the other sources. And this has been proved, and there are, and we're talking about including some American companies that are already working on this. So it seems to me very, very clear that in the relatively short term, we could have, as I said, these sort of triads of these three sources of energy in an integrated platform, providing, generating capacity in a host of varied scenarios, including small cities, isolated communities, or, I don't know, areas where you have intense economic activity in the middle of, let's say, an environmental sanctuary, but without generating all the adverse impacts.
So that is the very diplomatic approach.
Yeah.
But I think what the renewables industries know to be true is that if we got nuclear cheap enough, there wouldn't be a need for any other renewable source.
Well,
I mean, you could see nuclear as renewable. You can see this, call it whatever you want. If nuclear is cheap enough, because it can do everything that the others can do and more, it's the only, to me, it's the only necessary power source for a modern, thriving civilization.
Ultimately, yes, because it's directly from the sun, right?
Right.
But what you could also consider is the fact that, well, ultimately, these things have to be transitioned. No?
Right,
they have to go through processes, and that's why nobody in the Brazilian government talks about that. About 20. We'll just take it because ultimately you have to sell this to a varied audience. No? Yeah. So I think if we can aim for 6% in the next 10, 15, 20 years, I think that's very good. And then we'll see what happens then. The other point I was going to make is that, along the lines of what you've been saying, is that ultimately small modular reactors will ultimately be, they will come off the conveyor belt.
Yes.
They'll be industry made. And they will be very small. So decommissioning will not be a problem. The level of,
the upfront capital won't be as much.
Much smaller. The risk of
project completion won't be as much. Yes.
And critical mass, it will cool down on its own because you don't have that. So the advantages are enormous. And just look what happened in exactly the solar and wind energy technology in the last 10, 15 years. Prices have plummeted.
Yes, and that is because they had a manufacturing capability.
Exactly.
I know nuclear's got to move in that direction.
So if you get there, it's really going to be a hard sell for the others. I think so. So in a way, I think you're absolutely right. But ultimately, you have to be prudential. But there's one point which is slightly more philosophical, but which I think goes to your point. If you go back to the 17th century, the age of enlightenment, age of scientific revolution, and when knowledge became science, what happened? You basically had a fragmentation of knowledge which transformed into individual sciences. So you had the mother science, which is philosophy and history, and suddenly all the other sciences, sort of the hard sciences and then other soft science, social sciences, developed out of it over the following centuries. What's happening now is the reverse. We are seeing a process of recrystallization or reunification, if you want, of all knowledge, because today we know that everything is nuclear in origin.
Yes.
Right? So you don't have chemists. You have nuclear chemists. You have and so forth and so on. So all knowledge, scientific knowledge, ultimately today brings you back, refers you back to the nuclear atomic energy of everything that is.
I've never heard it put as eloquently as that.
Yeah.
But that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So ultimately, when you want to identify the oil, the spillages we're having now in our coast, where does oil come from? It's ultimately a question of nuclear physics to identify precisely where the oil came from. And that goes for everything in life, ultimately. No?
Yeah.
So in a way, we're all shrinking down back to the essential of nuclear science. No? So nuclear science is the new philosophy of history.
That's amazing. So tell me, as we wrap up here, what are some of the challenges that you personally want to take on? And where do you see this going in the future? What is your most optimistic vision 10, 15 years from now?
I think that ultimately people are pragmatic. And when the results are there, people will give up reluctantly, but will give up their prejudices and their preconceptions. I think that nuclear technology is moving at a significant rate, and I think we will see that, as we were talking about the new applications of nuclear energy, this is inevitable. The challenge we have, I think, today in a country like Brazil is to make sure that the nuclear applications are available to as many people as possible. So it is, I think, unacceptable that today in Brazil, only 20% of the population have full access to nuclear medicine because it's expensive and people don't know about it. So one of the reasons for having the multi-purpose reactor is to increase the availability of radiopharmaceuticals, for example. So I think a conversion process of nuclear applications becoming more widely available and therefore allowing people to gradually have a better understanding of what nuclear really is and about the wider implications. And in terms of policies, I think one of the most important things, which are being done today, is educate the kids. I mean, once you're beyond a certain age, it's not going to be that easy. But if you start with young children, for example, in Brazil, we managed almost to do away with cigarettes. We've got plenty of problems, but children learn values, how to behave, what's important in life, and I think we can overcome this sort of atavistic fear of nuclear if we start at young age. And there are very interesting projects in Brazil and many other countries in this area. So I think this is an absolutely critical agenda item, which I think should be part of school curriculum and so forth. And there are a lot of interesting initiatives in Brazil in this field. So I think this is one challenge. Personally, I would like to be able to work in this field for a couple more years because we've only talked about generation and issues of, let's say, peaceful applications. But there's a whole other range of issues having to do with disarmament, safeguards, the safety of these installations, and providing technical cooperation, as I said, to enlarge the availability of nuclear services. And this is the range of activities that the agency is covering today. And so there you have an example of lots of work to be done. And one last point, which I think goes in many ways to the core of this. I think globally, we haven't seen any progress in terms of multilateral. We talk about globalization and the risk and the need to work together and to identify common goals. No? But in having anything to do with the safety and defense, this hasn't been the case. No? The only significant international agreement that really promotes global peace and stability in the world, in the nuclear field in the last 30 years is the JCPOA, the joint agreement to control Iran's nuclear program. And the agency is a very important actor here. And this is an area which concentrates a lot of our efforts because at this moment, as I'm sure you know, we're in a very tense situation. The US having left that agreement and Iran now being tempted to not to fulfill its commitments. And it's a big challenge for us to keep this working. So although we can talk and must talk about all the fantastic nuclear peaceful applications of the nuclear industry, and this must be at the forefront of our agenda, we must never forget that the risk of nuclear proliferation and therefore the need for disarmament is so important.
Yes. Marcel Biato, thank you so much.
My pleasure.